Okay, we're beginning on page 119, which is then the rest of this book was the assignment. And as you'll notice, what it says, basic structure of Hebrew narrative and poetry. Well, what it's doing is dealing with the narrative and the poetry with heavy emphasis on the syntactical aspects of it, okay? Which of course is very helpful to look at. As you go to this one I'm saying about the way in which it's laid out, as you go to another chapter, let's see getting beneath the surface on page 149. Now we've got narrative literature again. Now he's looking at it from the way in which we kind of were looking at it in the other book, if you recall. So there are issues of setting there, characterization. He doesn't get into it as deep as the other book does. He doesn't have the same exegetical guidelines laid out, at least, like the other book. Okay? But he does have more examples. Okay? And so it may give you another pattern, if you will, for how to develop your story. Okay? So, he deals with the main points that we've talked about before. Some of it would be repetition, or is repetition. But then he has more illustrations than the other book does. So that's helpful. Later on, we'll talk about the poetic side, which is but right now, looking at the chapter 6, just kind of walking through it, and ask if there's any questions you had about reading this. It's mostly syntactical related, but if you have any questions.
Now I'll get those on our syntax course.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Took what we learned and added to it and clarified and added one together.
Right. The key for our purposes of, let's say, the narrative is what syntax signals a change here, a movement. That's key. Okay, so, looking at reading it with that kind of idea in mind, then it could be helpful to isolate things in particular context. Nothing beyond that I don't want to mention. I don't believe there. It gets into poetry. We'll talk about that later on when we get into poetry, so we can't really deal with that. And I don't think, is there anything in the chapter 7 which is similar to what we've already done, but anything that would that you have any questions about there? In the narrative side, not so much poetry side.
I'm still not sure I understand what a foil is.
Which what?
A foil?
A foil?
Yeah.
It's a element of the story, or likely than not personages there, who, because of their presence, provide some dimension to the story that you would not otherwise have. For instance, in the Abraham story, the servants, Isaac or Abraham, and Mount Moriah story. Right? The servants are individuals there to whom Abraham simply says, "You stay here, we'll come back." And he goes up and sacrifices his son, but then he comes back. And so they are, in a sense, testimonies to the event See what I'm saying? The story we had yesterday on the prophets, the son of Elisha, well, the 50, okay? They're kind of individuals who help to confirm the conclusion, but there's no characterization of them. It's just 50 men, okay, fine. And their role is to search and see if what seemed to have happened really happened. Right? So it's just an element of the story that kind of helps focus a particular aspect of it, but there's no characterization, no development of them. If they weren't there, there would be something missing in the whole story. You take, I suppose, another example would be in Joseph's story, where Potiphar's wife is trying to entice him, so to speak. The servants, there's mention of servants in there. The servants really don't play a function, right, other than the fact that they become witnesses to what she says about what happened. Right? So they become an element that she uses to convince her husband that Joseph is wrong.
Sure. So in my story, where I've got Saul trying to pin David to the wall with the spear, the women who are singing would be a foil of some sort then?
They're there for a reason. That may well be. Jonathan's there. It's not character. I believe he's there. If I remember that. Might be. If he's, I have to go back and reread the story, but if he's there, he's not developed. His characterization is not developing anything. I have to go back and reread that particular aspect of the story. So when you're looking at characterization, then you have to ask the question: who are the characters? What role do they play? Are they primary characters, which you break down as characters that are developed? Be the protagonist, and the antagonist be the opposite. But they're somewhat developed. Who else is in the story, and why are they there? What do they contribute? Okay. They would be kind of your foil type entities. So he's got a description of that. Is this? Oh. Notice on page 153 where he discusses that in our book here. The minor character who's nevertheless wrong may be called a supporting actress or actor, while a minor character who's flat may be labeled an agent. Agents abound. In the biblical story, they're often stereotypical when they function as foils. Right? Because their role tends to be purely functional rather than experience or behavior. Minor characters should be a lesson for the reader. They're there to tell you a portion part, but their characterization is not developed, and it just helps to bring out an aspect of the story. Okay. Anything else about that from the standpoint of the narrative side? We'll get to the side later on.
Well, it was interesting that he said Naomi was the central character of the book of Ruth. I never read it that way before. I always figured, well, the name of the book after Ruth, so it's got to be her story.
Yeah. Well, she is a primary character, It's kind of interesting that, in one sense, the whole movement of the story does focus somewhat on Naomi because she was this embittered woman. But right in the middle, in fact, the exact middle of the book, okay, is when the whole story switches over in a more positive vein, and Naomi, takes on a different characteristics. But you're right. When you come to the conclusion, Naomi is in the end of the book, but really it's focusing more on Boaz and Ruth and the genealogy that develops off of that. So, which is of course part of the important messianic and I guess you would say causes shift in its colors history of the Bible. So, yeah. So she would be a primary protagonist. There's more than one. I think, in that book. So, now, in he talks about this. Brings up the prophecy business as well. It's not in chapter 6. It's weaved into somewhat into other chapters. Let's see if I can find it right now. I had it, it's not too long. Well, maybe that's the chapter. But anyway, making it contemporary, which would be chapter 9, he goes into the narrative stuff again. So you get some more perspective on maybe how to develop some of the narrative by reading that section again. He develops that a little bit, and he develops a couple of examples. I think I was very clear to make sure that the passages I gave you guys were not broken out in some of these books. Let's see, prosperity back on way on page 258. We talked about prophecy yesterday. We do it again today a little bit. And 258 he talks about the prophecy aspect. Okay, hermeneutical guidelines. See that. See that. Some similarities with what we had before. The word of judgment speaks as almost whom your artist is guilty of the same crimes. Well, it's true because of the different culture, different setting, different covenantal concept. Covenant is different, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable, of course. Right? And then on page 260, number 2, when preaching, teaching from the prophet salvation, or those don't sensationalize the message or assume the role of a crystal ball gazer. Primary purpose of great visions of the future is not to satisfy curiosity about coming events or to test our ability to decode cryptic sayings. They're designed instead to stimulate faith in God's sovereignty, assure God's people that essentially God's in control and is going to bring his promises to pass. Detailed last statement is dealing with the scent details is important, but only so far as it contributes to understanding the overall theological principle of the passage leads to a meaningful application of that principle. Well, at the same token, you could read that in the sense of saying, well, then I don't have to really deal with all the details. No, you do need to deal with the details because you don't know which one's going to contribute to the understanding until you deal with all the details of the text. That's why I'm kind of an advocate of, let's do the hard work. Let's do the difficult work of looking very closely, at every aspect of the text before we kind of bring it to an interpretive conclusion here. Okay? Otherwise, you may not get to where you need to be. Okay? Then we'll look back at some of this perhaps again when we get the poetry side today. Okay? We'll perhaps in an extensive way. So any further questions or anything at this point? Okay, we'll come back to it. It's let's see, I should pull it, let's see, to do this last section. No, I can't find it right off. Chapter. Statement. There's a statement in here that he makes in our section that we're supposed to read. It says, essentially says, do not overlook the tedious, that terminology that comes pretty close to the tedious and time-consuming work of syntax analysis and all of the stuff we're talking, emphasizing. I think exactly what that is, but again, this is a repetition from his perspective. Again, we need to do the hard work before we start making proclamations. We'll come back to that when we get some of our other texts. Now we want to finish out looking at prophecy a little bit. We're pretty broad brushing it at this point. Two basic kinds, right? What are they?
Salvation, judgment.
Judgment and salvation. Usually the judgment comes first, and the salvation, the deliverance aspect is developed. Because the prophet's role, is as a pointing out the faults, if you will, right? And then to explain consequences, which would be the curses of the covenant, more often than not. Consequences of living in a life of sin. And then branches out into what you have opportunity to change, which then comes the blessing side, and that's the salvation deliverance side. Okay, so that's pretty generalized, but that's kind of focuses where it's all at. So we want to make sure we can finalize that. Let's see. I just want to look at the back end of my work. Oh, let me look at the front end of my work. Haggai, okay. We're doing an exegesis of Proverbs just like anything else, right? We do the historical study. I picked up from Eugene Merrill this very lengthy historical study. I'm not going to go through that, obviously, but it gives all the necessary data that I need to get going with the book. And so we get the historical context with dates and everything else is very good on that. But also what I want to get to, and what I'm interested in, after we get through all history, the literary context of the book, okay? So I want to know something about that, and the kind of what is connected to other books of the Old Testament that it's connected with. So if there's a parallelism, if there's some parallel passages you're looking at, you're better off if you can find them in those books that are post-exilic, right? Then depend upon ones that may be Mosaic era or whatever. Okay. Language and style, Okay. Let's see what was on. Scholars have debated whether it was composed only in prose. Our Bible here, BHK, actually VHS, is similar. It identifies certain ones as poetry. Okay, so the question is really a little different. It's difficult sometimes for scholars to be in unanimity about is this poetry or not. See what I'm saying? For example, just as an example of that, if you look at Genesis 12, you say, well, gee, this looks like it should be laid out in poetry. And in some translations, it does appear to be laid out in poetry. But in the first few verses here, about the covenant, right? Go from your land and your kingdom and the house of your father's land, which I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation, I'll bless you. There's some elements of poetry that appear to be there. And yet the Hebrews, of course, in this text did not define it that way as such. And there's some little debate, in fact, goes on with this business about how much, if poetry is elevated prose, that's what it says here, okay, how much elevation is it before it can be classified as poetry? And how much metric similarity is there, okay, to be able to classify as poetry or not? In this passage here, there seems to be some symmetry involved. Well, that's kind of cool. There seems to be even some chiastic development in there. That happens in prose too, right? There seems to be some metrical similarity. I'm just looking at verse 3. This is an example. 1, 2. It's a 2, 2 for line, for one line, if you want to call it a line. Then the latter part would be 2 and 2 there. So that would be metrically same as far as beats are concerned in scan, so to speak. Same is true with Haggai. Now, we were in Haggai 1, and we said, is this poetry or not? I mean, it seems to lay out in poetry, right? And yet, some say, no, it's just prose. That's because, in some degree, he's not quite the same quality of a poet as an Isaiah or a Zechariah or those other poets, right? Which are pretty obvious and easy to classify. So it's some question about that. But there is poetic elements to it, which we'll look at a few of those things. Okay. Here, the driver's assessment appears to be borne out by the stylistic devices that appear with regularity. The parallelism of 1:6. Well, Haggai 1:6. Where does it say? You have sowed much, brought in little. Eaten, not enough to satisfy. Drunk, not enough to make you drunk. Right? Put clothes on, and still you're not warm. Right? And the person who goes out to make money, makes it for the purpose of putting in a bag of gold. But then you can scan that, and you end up with something that looks like a defined meter, if you will. Okay? And so you begin to wonder about poetic dimensions of this. The metric rhythm of 1, 3 to 6. If I were to scan that, I would see, there's quite a similarity in a rhythm to that. I'll show you how to scan it with the poetry. And then you'll be able to do that yourself in chapter 2. We use a chiastic framing in 1:4, chapter 1, verse 4. It's a time for you yourselves dwell in your paneled houses. This house lies desolate. Now, where it's getting the chiastic framing in that aspect is where he encompasses or puts together with paneled houses and this house. And on the outside is a time for you, in a sense, to leave the house desolate. Desolate is a time for this desolation. And putting internally, putting the house, paneled houses, in a temple again. That's what it's talking about. Because, normally how you would write this in a strict prose fashion, okay, right? And you wouldn't perhaps put those two ideas together, right? But they might be more separated in the sentence. Or let's take the other example we've got here in verse 9. See if that's any clearer here. Okay. You look or turn towards for much, look for much and behold little. And you bring it into the house and I've blown on it. Now where you got there, of course, is you look for much. Kind of there's a parallelism apparently. You bring it into the house, that is much, and it turns into little. Blown on it, that's why apparently. Let me see. I don't know that I could see in there what I would classify as chiastic. But maybe between 9 and 10, he's trying to balance that, see it between both verses. I'm not sure I see it very clearly there either, but he did. So that's part of the question. Let's see about the poetic aspect of it. Dialogue style is certainly there, that's clear. And then we have no problem with the fact that there's paramacia, or the verb for destruction and drought. Houses, we've seen that, that's pretty easy to see. So there's some questions about that. Literary integrity, we won't get into that, but you just read the commentaries to see some wonder about whether or not this is a consistent work by one person, etc., or there was pieced together from different sources. Part. There's a question in our passage here, chapter 1. About the very end. So he uses a terminology here, kind of inclusio, that is, the fact that it begins with a date and then our passage ends with a date. So but there's some question on whether or not that date goes to the next chapter. Let's see. And how exactly all this is supposed to fit together. So there's some issue. There, talks about possible redaction process of the verb structure. We know this judgment of speech from Westermann. Okay, there's a reason or an accusation there, isn't there? We saw that yesterday, and then the messenger formula, the results of that, although it's not spelled out. There is also a prophetic oracle here. Okay. In our section at the very end, where I came on, this is still his work, but Merrill's part of Merrill's work. Let's see, transmission of the text. Okay, the introduction, verse 1, chapter 1. Let's just see. Speech, accusation, essentially 2 to 4, with that, thus says the Lord of hosts. The announcement 5 to 6, as well as 9 to 11, therefore, because of this, what says, judgments based on the curses. So there's the judgment form that is isolated for us there. And then in chapter 1, the oracle of salvation, or the salvation dimension of it, indication of the situation 7 to 11, why all this is going on. And then a proclamation in verse 13, because the Lord said, spoken to that, I am with you, utterance of the Lord, or it's a positive thing, and then he works within the individuals to get the work done and solve the problem. Right? So that is clear enough. Poetic elements in chapter 1, I just noted this. Some of this, let's see, repetition, we know we've seen that. Paranasia, the word karave, or root. In the repetition of, consider your ways, right? Your thoughts in your heart, so to speak. And then there's a word pair. That's more of a poetic aspect in verse 10. When he has the heavens and the earth, that's part of the poetry thing for recall. In other words, there's a number of words that are paired, and where you expect to see one in poetry, you expect to see another one, the other one. Okay? So there's a number of word pairs that occur. There's just one that is a typical word pair in the Old Testament quite often, and then there's appears in verse 10 there. Okay? And then, in fact, that's where he has the kind of chiastic framing in verse 10. You can see that, therefore, upon you, or over you, the heavens have ceased from dew. So there's the heavens there, in its position. We have to translate it where it's out of position. But then the next word is the earth. So the heavens and the earth are put close together. And then on the outside of that is ceased, heaven ceased, and earth ceased, right? And then, so that's kind of a chiastic frame. So that's kind of the poetic elements. Anything else you want to ask about this?
Actually, yeah, there was something you said yesterday. Going back up to verse 6.
Okay.
And you're talking about the infinitives in there.
Yeah.
And
Go back to verse 9.
It didn't stick out to me last night. I was thinking about it this morning. What you said made it sound almost like, do those function like a attendant circumstance participle kind of way in Greek? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they're taking the place of finite verbs.
So they could translate it as a finite verb?
Yeah.
Okay.
But they're also carrying over the syntax of the primary verb, the first verb rather, put it in the past. You sowed much, but then you take it in. Look. Right? So you put that temporal aspect is dictated by the first verb, which is not an infinitive concept. Absolutely. So that becomes the primary key to the temporal element. Otherwise, infinitive, of course, would take on any time frame, so can the verb itself. But it's pretty clear in the context that they're experiencing drought and problems. It's not that they will. So the infinitive absolute could take on. You'd be used in place of a finite verb. Anything else? Confused enough, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to get into the poetry stuff. It's really what I want to. Excuse me, we're going to get a wisdom lecture, which there is poetry there as well. Okay? In fact, it's almost all poetry. Okay. A couple of books I'll just mention here. Barry, it's a good book. Introduction to Wisdom and Poetry of the Old Testament. I can highly recommend that. Again, I put an introduction to the Old Testament. Harrison has a good introduction to wisdom books. Our book, Cracking Old Testament Codes, is there again, and we'll talk a little bit about that briefly here in a minute after I hit the rather brief notes that I have here. This is the statement here. Wisdom literature emphasizes practical morality, describing the conduct that God desired. Well, that's pretty obvious. Practical morality. Okay. Some people put it in the context of common sense, right? And there's some common sense to that, but there's also the fact that it's not just common sense, it's practical morality, if you will, or how to live right in relationship to the covenant. Okay? But if you don't plug the covenant concept in, then it could go anywhere. Wisdom is viewed as practical orientation of life centered around keeping the stipulations of the covenant. And Proverbs and Ecclesiastes fit there. Okay. Pre-Mosaic period, we got Job. Okay. Wisdom rests on revelation of God apart from the specific requirements of the Mosaic law, but there's still a revelation of God involved. There's no here in Job, the difficulties associated with Job itself. Difficulties associated with Job itself. Here, I just have note a few things here. The events of the book indicating patriarchal time. We don't have to go through all that. The events itself indicate patriarchal times, right? So we've got laid to some early dates, okay, and various reasons for that. But then I want to get to the writing of the book is not the same as the events portrayed. The writing of the book seems the dates from the time of Moses of the 2nd century BC have been proposed. In other words, it's all over the map, okay, as to when it was written. Okay. Most reasonable date, my conclusion, seems to be the Solomonic era. So if it was patriarchal times, even Abrahamic time frame, and now we're talking about the Solomonic era. We're talking about quite a significant span of time there. The era produced most of Israel's canonical wisdom literature. Again, with contemporary matters in the book relate well to the era. None of the other proposed dates that could have been conclusively argued. And this means then that the events in Job and the recording of those events were separated by hundreds of years. So some have a problem with that, saying, how could it be accurate then? Okay. Well, oral tradition, along with some possible written material, span the gap of the story, and the anonymous author placed it in wisdom literature format. Document inspiration is not affected, really. Superintendent of the Holy Spirit can account for that. Okay. But the point is that we're simply mentioning here is that in some of this literature, you've got pre-Mosaic period, but the book itself was written in the Solomonic era, which means what? It means that a lot of the syntax, even the way in which wisdom literature was developed, that is, its formats and whatever, are not necessarily pre-Mosaic period. So if you're going to do a word study, okay, you do a word study in that book of Job, let's say, you really want to do a word study by focusing in on that literature that was written during Solomon's time frame, if possible, and not depend upon everything by going way back into the Pentateuch, let's say. See what I'm saying? Or even jump forward in the Malachi or something. Okay? So that's where it becomes exegetically important. Okay? Wisdom literature is of 4 kinds. That's just one possibility or statement. I'll bring that up in a second. Juridical has to do with law, stuff like that. Nature, sort of practical, just simply practical stuff. A lazy person is going to constantly be without food and stuff like that. And then theological. Okay, now I got a little part of the Hayes book that's in this is a little section on Hayes' book that's in the bibliography here. It's found here. Get the whole thing in there. What she mentions the various things that I just mentioned over here. That's why I'm not going to read that. What I want to get at is, if you can see this at all, yeah, okay. Wisdom literature has its origins in the family. And from the period of clan, it does derive many of the proverbs and purposes to equip one for the mastery of life regardless of circumstance. Okay, so that's a different setting, in other words, than, let's say, a setting within a royal setting, family setting, or a tribal setting. Okay? So there's a setting in life that's important to this. Okay? There's another aspect of what I want to mention here. No, it's not yet. Towards the end. There's a multi-verse structuring of various proverbs. We'll talk about this, we'll see that. As well as a acrostic categorizing sequence of larger paragraphs. In other words, we think in terms of the proverbs as they are one verse, two verse kind of things, and they're separated from one another. We'll see that's not actually the case. There's ways in which some of many of these are tied together. Okay? So we need to look at that. Oh yeah, 8 categories are going to be discussed. Proverbs, riddles, fable, allegory, hymn and prayer, dialogue, confession, lists, active poetry, which is teaching something, and even some narrative stuff. All of that is in the context of wisdom literature. Okay? And this particular book develops each of those. So that could be a very helpful book for us. So I'm sure I put off too much for this. And that book is Hayes' Old Testament Foreign Criticism. So it's very helpful. And he develops it more than some of the others have. Here's a list of some that are added that he didn't include. He's got proverbs, riddles, fables, allegories, hymns, and prayer, dialogue, confession, which he didn't mention. I don't think maybe lists. It's only for an example, and then epic poetry. Now here's a statement from Harrison about this. As in other cultures, wisdom in its full sense was attributable to God alone, who manifests his wisdom alike in the creation of the world and mankind. This wisdom included an infallible means of discrimination between good and evil. As such, it constituted the basis for the rewards of the righteous and just punishment of the wicked. Okay, and then we have to keep in mind that it's really related then to the difference between good and evil, because as God established what is good and what is evil, and in our context now, it's in the covenant. In many instances. Since all wisdom was derived from God, there must be ultimately a religious element in what the Hebrews envisaged as wisdom. From them, this was an important statement, I think we mentioned it before. There is no dichotomy between the intellectual and practical, the religious and the secular. While they recognize that the knowledge of the fear of the Lord constituted the highest form of wisdom, so it's clearly connected to the revelation of God. They were aware that worldly wisdom, though less elevated in nature, was different only in degree, not in kind, from divine wisdom. That is, when you get to a nature proverb, for instance. Okay? Well, there's wisdom involved in the nature proverb. We'll maybe briefly look at the very first one and see, well, there's wisdom there, but it's only different in kind from the kind of wisdom that say, statement say, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding, etc. That's different than, a bird flying around, which we'll look at briefly, as the element of wisdom to consider. The whole life was thus connoted in terms of religious experience. Wisdom that will be relevant to all points of existence. And that's from, and expanded more, of course, from Harrison. Just some exegetical things to consider, and then we'll look at the book which talks more about it. We define the form in which the passage consists. Okay. And not only that, when it comes to the book of Proverbs, we also have to define the limits of the section. In other words, is one verse, two verses, paragraph, three paragraphs, and do they interrelate with one another, and how? Okay. Beyond this, we look at the setting in Israel's life of the passage involved. For instance, that well-known passage, train up a child the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. What is the context of that? What is the setting in life that is about? Who is that talking about? And there's a lot of different answers to that. And probably, at least in my mind, probably the viewpoint that has the greater credence is the viewpoint that it relates to an individual young man who is being trained, if you will, to enter into that the public arena as an adult, right, and as a leader of the community. Okay. As opposed to what to do with your little child at home. Well, that's a different setting in life for the passage, which comes out with very different meanings there. Okay? And then, of course, in connection to the Mosaic covenant that it may have. Before I get any illustrations, let's look at a couple. Let's look what he says about dealing with wisdom literature in page 255. Well, actually, it starts on 233 of Proverbs in this book. Okay. One of the things I want to note on page 234, okay, Proverbs are short. Well, some of them get to be pretty long, the first 10 chapters or the 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs. Okay. And they're salty, he says, which means what? It means I guess what he means by that is it has to do with familiar things and things that we all will encounter at some point in time. They're built around concrete images, okay, appear to be a fixed formula to some of them, okay. So, in other words, they're patterned in a way that are very common. For instance, antithetical patterns, okay, or a pattern of certain proverbs that 6 things the Lord hates, you don't like 7 he hates, however that word goes. There's a number of those that occur. Okay. Or the better than pattern, number of proverbs. Okay, that's what he's talking about here, about paradigms too. And then they're poetically crafted. So they're poetry. So that brings different dimensions to it. Okay, the poetry. That dimensions have different dimensions from the standpoint of word order, from the standpoint of syntax, from the standpoint of figurative language, and all kinds of rhetorical features. Got to keep that in mind all the time. Okay? Another issue is the parallelism. We'll talk about that when we get poetry specifically, but it's often a mistake when we have a parallel lines and we make too much out of the balancing members instead of seeing them as really saying essentially the same thing, but maybe just a little more concrete, but we just take it and blow it out of proportion, the difference out of proportion sometimes. So anyway, that's key. Let's get to on page 240, you can see some 11 types of proverbs. You know that He's got 11 types listed there, so there are different kinds, and we'll deal with a different kind, and take a particular kind of approach to those kinds. So just look at one, for instance, the better than saying. He breaks down each and every one. Where is the better than saying there? Let's see, paradox. Oh, there it is on page 242. Better a poor man whose walk is blameless than a rich man whose ways are perverse. And later on in the passage, in that second paragraph, he says it is more correct to understand better than proverbs as exclusive proverbs that eliminate one element and affirm another. Thus, readers should ask what is being affirmed, what is being eliminated. Right? That takes a little different tact than to say that it's just a matter of relativistic preference. Well, I'm saying, no, that's not how you understand that. See? You just eliminate. One is to be eliminated in favor of the other. Abomination sayings. We won't get into that, but there's various kinds of sayings. Paradoxical sayings, now that's always confuses people on page 244. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. See, at the very bottom paragraph, it begins, paradoxical proverbs encourage the listener to ponder more complex levels of thought. Right? In other words, don't initially say, there's a contradiction in Scripture here. This doesn't make any sense. Well, they're written there and they're put together, really, for us to consider and balance them off of one another. Okay? And balance them off of one another. And there's truth. There's no contradiction when you think deeper than just the surface level here. Like, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly. No, that seems contradictory. Okay? But it's really not when you examine the total together. Okay? So that's important. Let's go to how to interpret Proverbs. Page 249. Accept the proverb for what it is, both attention on specific situations, etc. Very obvious, I think. It's looking at something specific, look at one particular aspect of life. Look for verifying examples and counter-examples within a collection of proverbs. In other words, you can look at the same thing from two perspectives. Okay? One perspective may look at the issue in a positive way, and another proverb may look at the same issue, but look at it from a negative way. Okay? And you could say, you function this way and life will be good, right? Or you can look at another passage and say, bad things will happen if you don't function this way. You see what I'm saying? So looking at it from different perspectives. Recognize the poetic ways that sages express their wisdom, parallelism, and all of that needs to be brought in, and we'll illustrate some of that. Look for pairs and strings of proverbs, strings, word pairs. And very often, there'll be a light word or a key word that begins to tie different proverbs together. Okay? And as we've seen before, similar root words, roots of words with different meaning that connect ideas together, passages together. That occurs. Examine the proverb itself, word order, meaning of words, all of that. Identify the specific value the proverb is communicating. That's not always easy. One proverb I like to mention to people the way in which it's translated by a lot of but the NIV in particular. A particular proverb. This is the proverb. You know the proverb probably because you've said, yes, this is my secret to success and prosperity.
Where you at?
Proverbs 16, verse 3, page 1295. Last verse. Roll on Yahweh, commit to Yahweh, your works. And here's the way it is translated. And you will have success. Something like that. Oh, gee, that's great. I love that promise. Right?
I saw that on bookmark.
Oh, did you? Yeah. Well, there's a problem with that, you see, because how many people have committed to the Lord what they intend to do and say, well, I'm assured of success, only to find that it's not successful. Right? Failure that occurred. So either the proverb lied, right? Or I don't understand it, or it's not translated right. You understand? So in this case, in that passage, it's just not translated. And the meanings of the words aren't given right, aren't given the proper focus. For instance, wherein does the last word is literally is thoughts, your thoughts. Where do you get success out of the word thoughts? That's what they translate. And not only that, it fails to recognize the syntax of the second half of the verse, begins with a vav, and an imperfect, and that's a subordinate clause, and it's not a parallel, necessarily a strictly paratactic clause. Okay? The first part is usually no problem. Roll on or give to Yahweh your works, or commit to Him your works, what you want to do. Okay, now, you read it another way with the proper syntax. In order that, take that as a purpose idea, or even result, in order that your thoughts about your works, obviously, may be established. Now, what you're doing then in that, you're committing what you intend to do or would like to do to the Lord, and you're inviting Him into your thought processes, right? It doesn't say you therefore will be successful in that which you're trying to do. It says you and God will be working together, all right? And your thoughts will be established as to what to do, right? How to do it. And that's very similar to the concept we have in the book of James, as a matter of fact. But, well, beyond that, it's just an example of where the translation just turns it into, frankly, I hate to say it so bluntly, but it's just plain outright a lie. In the NIV, it just does not pan out. It's not even good translation. It's a lousy interpretation. Well, that's only one example. Okay, so those are Proverbs, how to interpret Proverbs there. Let's just briefly look at something about non-proverbial wisdom, page 255. Okay. In the middle of that first paragraph, it says that proverbial wisdom sets truth on the table, openly visible and within easy reach of all. Then, by analogy, non-proverbial wisdom ties truth securely in a wrapped package and places it on a shelf, well out of reach and almost out of sight. In other words, it's a little more difficult to get that grab a hold of it, if you will. Okay. So the concepts, what is non-proverbial wisdom? Well, in some ways, non-proverbial wisdom is almost anti-wisdom in some ways. In fact, the book of Exegesis is really classified in that fashion. At the very end, on page 257, before the next section there, proverbial wisdom is characterized by an authoritative quality, a pragmatic worldview, and an ethical purpose, while non-proverbial wisdom adopts a reflective stance towards institutions, authority figures, speculative, occasionally counter-wisdom worldview, and a theological and philosophical approach to personal ethics. So it looks at it quite differently. Okay? Matter of fact, the book of Job tends to be counter-wisdom, in the sense, in fact, it says, where is the non-proverbial wisdom, page 268? In the book of Job, right there, okay? Well, and what Ecclesiastes? Now, where do we get this little song from? Where do we get the idea of counter-wisdom? Well, wisdom, the ancient sage wisdom is, if you obey God and live rightly, you will be blessed in your life. Right? Job is not being blessed in his life from the human perspective, therefore he must not be walking with God. Right? The whole book counters that. It attacks that whole thing. It essentially says, I am walking with God, and I'm not being blessed in my life, and I don't understand it. Right? It doesn't seem to fit the normal pattern of wisdom here. Okay? And the whole book is connected up like that. Okay? And so it's counter-wisdom, if you will. And if you don't read it that way, then you're going to really get mixed up as to the meaning of the book. Same way with Ecclesiastes. Okay? It's really counter-wisdom. He calls this anti-wisdom wisdom. Page 270. Okay? So it's an example of speculative, pessimistic, or discussion wisdom, that is because of either anti-wisdom. Right? I like what it says on 271. Again, if you don't keep these concepts in mind, you misinterpret the book. But the purpose of counter-wisdom, like that found in Ecclesiastes, is to force the reader or listener to be brutally honest with both self and God. Right? I mean, let's face it. As an Ecclesiastic preacher would say, sin is fun. Sin gives me pleasure for a while. Right? Money is good. But I'm not happy. How come I'm not happy? Counter-wisdom. But it's become brutally honest. Okay? Song of Solomon. Now, there's a lot of interpretations of the Song of Solomon, of course. Some of them are pretty wild, allegorical. Need a good, if you not need, but would like to read a good allegorical approach to it, of course, read the Amplified Bible version of the Song of Solomon. I don't know if you ever read it or not. But that's the allegorical approach. There's another way to do it. It's really love poetry, which is a genre in and of itself. Found in Egypt and other places. And this is the only example, however, specifically I believe in the Old Testament of love poetry. So the interpretive principles for non-proverbial wisdom, page 273, identify the genre or subgenre. What kind of form it's in, that's important always. Note the distinction between a proverb and a law. Now there's where a mistake is often made, right? A proverb and a law. Wisdom presents itself as normative truisms, not absolute claims. Normally this would happen and this is followed. That leaves room for exceptions. But so often they're interpreted as promises. And part of the reason that, I think, is the way in which they're translated in English. Translated often with a futuristic element to the so-called promise side. For instance, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart. There's a promise. No, it's not a promise. Okay. Should be translated differently in a way that doesn't reflect that.
Our beginning grammar had a chunk where they looked at that proverb and they say it's actually a a sarcastic warning, and they don't understand where the translation, the way he should go, comes from.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's more a warning against neglectful parenting. If you train up a child in his own way, which is his natural sinful bent, then even when he's old, he's not going to depart from it. So part of parenting is beating the sinful nature out of him. Something to that effect.
Yeah.
But he thinks it's translated that way because the King James translators were scared off by the sarcasm in it.
There's a good article. I don't know if I have it in here. A good article that gets all the views of that particular verse. I mean, not all, but the main views of that verse. And it goes into great detail on and then see if I got it here for me. And then if I have, then I don't know if I got the article here or the name. Let's see, Proverbs 1, outline 16:3, 1, 2, yeah, not even mine. Check something else here. Let's see if I can get the name of it. Where's my file? See if I can get my file here. Okay. Here you go. This is it right here. This is the name of it. I don't have all the details. It's my file. Train Up a Child by Hildebrandt. You probably download it or something. I don't have it with me right now, so I can't tell you where it's from.
So it's an article?
Yeah. It's
I'll look for it.
Huh?
I'll look for it.
Yeah.
Hildebrandt?
Hildebrandt. I forget the first. I don't know the first name. But the name of it is Train Up a Child. Question mark. It's a good article. By the way, just as long as I'm here, notice this in my file as well. I didn't bring it. I should maybe sometime just put it in my notes as a mediocrity. But Guidelines for Understanding and Proclaiming the Book of Proverbs by Parson. Good article. Again, I don't have it with me, so it's in the same genre as we have Guidelines for Narrative Literature. Okay. Let's see, where was that from? I think I have that in good sack. Let me see if that's the case.
Yeah, it's from Grace Theological Journal, 1988.
Oh, is it? Yeah. It's a good article.
He takes it as it's best understood as according to what is expected. The original intent of this verse is to address a late adolescent's entrance into his place in adult society.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's also a different translation than even what we discussed.
Yeah. He deals with so many of the other views, and deals with it exegetically.
Yeah, there's a lot of work here.
And, yeah, it's a good. I forget how long it is. It's a pretty good size article. That was in Grace Journal, he said. Okay.
And it's also available online.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. That's some good stuff. Okay. Let me walk through a few. Let's see. I bet I got one. Be a good start for us if we can. I don't know. What is that? Let's see what it is. I thought I had a good PowerPoint presentation on a particular proverb that children to mention. I'll mention that so I'll focus on that a little bit in the next exercise. We'll look at some really interesting stuff. And the one that I haven't translated, we'll go over that when we come back here. There's a lot of dimensions in that whole section there that'll clue us into certain things about Proverbs and how to deal with them. But there's some extremely unique stuff in the book that you can't see unless you look at the original text. 5:15 to 20, this section right in here. Okay? And I'll point out some other things about, after we translate it, about the whole area and some of the concepts that you can see in Proverbs there. Okay. Let me see if we can do a translation first. Page 1281.
Drink water from your sister.
And flowing waters.
Flowing waters, here we go. From your well.
Mm-hmm.
See, July. No. I didn't get a chance to look at this one. Or didn't take the chance, maybe would be a better way to say it. But
You didn't translate it?
no, I didn't look at this one yet.
Oh, okay. We'll work on it. Let's get a translation out. So, subject is your springs, second word.
Okay.
Flow hoops would be to spread, flow
Okay.
to the outside, but there, as you see in the context, it becomes a question mark. Okay? So if you know a question mark, that's what I hate. Okay, so let them scatter your springs scatter to the outside. In the streets, these streams of water in the streets, should they, it's really a question at this point, should your streams be scattered to the outside, in the streets, streams of water in the streets? Let them be, and adjusted there, let them be to you, to yourself alone, okay, and not to strangers with you, okay. That your source, literally, okay, be blessed, right, and rejoice from the life of your youth. Okay. A robe, that is a female deer of some sort, of loves, and this is a mountain goat, female mountain goat, of grace. Interesting terms for the wife there. Her breasts, let them translate often as gratitude at all times, every time, all times. And her love, continually, may you continually, be intoxicated with her loves. Okay? And why should, I can't read it in that. It's kind of fuzzy right there, isn't it? But okay, why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a stranger, a strange woman, okay, and cling to the bosom of an alien woman? Okay. Now there's some interesting things that I want to note about the passage before I get to the specifics on that one. I want to notice a couple of things. I just want you to notice, for instance, you can't see it very well, but I have certain lines drawn, okay? in the text that I have. For instance, I have a line drawn from this word, and it's going to, on the top of the page, it's going to connect with a similar word, same word that occurs. A line drawn from this word here, okay, to this word here, okay, which is the connectedness involved in that particular element there. But maybe more easier for us, since that's what we just translated, was this word here occurs here. The intoxicated can simulate with her loves, and here what should be intoxicated my son with a strange woman. And then that word occurs down here in a context that is very different. Okay? Very different context. Because before the eyes of Yahweh are the ways of a man, and all his tracks are examined. He's examined. His iniquities will capture him along with the wicked, and at the courts of his sins he will be taken, grabbed. But then here, he will die without instruction. He will die apart from instruction. And in the multitude of his foolishness, he will be, and then it's translated differently in the translations altogether. But it's the same word. He will be intoxicated. Okay? This is just in a different context, and you could give a different translation, and translations do give a different translation to it. But this is an example of how we have connectedness between sections. This is clearly one section. Okay, there's no question about it. One section of the proverbial ideas, and here's another one. But there's a connectedness here through these various words. Okay, that happens very frequently. Okay, notice in chapter 6 here. See, we're caught. For the words that you are caught, and caught in the words of your mouth, and down here, and the same word occurs. Okay. The same word occurs here. Okay. It occurs down in this section right here, and you have a little different focus, a little different meaning, and then as you move into the next page, it connects up again. Okay. Really interesting. But the key thing one of the key things I want to point out in our section right here, the poetic element, is the sound factor that's involved. Okay? If you see the sound factor, notice the sound here. Mevorka here. Then at the end, the arka here. The same sound pattern cuts across that first line. Beit resh kaf, right? Okay. And that comes from, of course, the idea of a well or a cistern and a well, right? The sound pattern is there. Now look down below down here. Okay, now what we've got, similar sound pattern that occurs here in the line of verse 18, okay? That your source, if you will, okay, Nekorka, is very similar in sound to Lorka up here, okay? Nevorka, and then Baruch, right? Blessed. Okay? But what we've got going here is through the sound pattern, we've got the statement that if you are staying faithful to your spouse, right, through the sound pattern that's here, and that section, which down here focuses into the idea of blessing. Okay? Be blessed, right? Of course, be cursed, which is a good thing. That's based upon the sound. You got a sound pattern running through here. Then when you get down to this key line right here, the same sound pattern reappears. Different words with the same sound pattern, which then to the hearer, you see, cannot avoid making a connection. Okay? Right? And so that's one element that occurs frequently in the book of Proverbs. Let me show you a few other interesting little tidbits here. Well, first of all, let's just look at the first proverb that we have. That's a nature proverb. It's in the first chapter. Okay. Verse 17. After reading, we'll read through the section, but verse 17, because vain, okay, the net is spread out, okay, trap, etc., in the eyes of any wing or bird or master of the wing or bird, right? It's a nature proverb, which is to say, this is kind of a proverb that deals with how you catch birds, okay? So you put a net, hang a net between trees, okay, between branches of trees. Bird can't see the net, and he can fly into it, right? Well, if the bird, the point of the thing is, if the bird sees the net, he escapes it, right? If he sees a big picture, so to speak, he can escape being trapped and caught, right? Well, this whole section is talking about, my son, don't fall into the trap going along with these sinners, right? In other words, get the big picture. If you see the big picture, you won't get caught, okay? Right? Otherwise, you will be caught. And there's a lot of repetitions and whatnot occurring in that first section. The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, just as a point of interest here, has connected quite a bit of connected passages, long passages. Okay, for instance, chapter 9 is a one whole integrated section there. Okay, when you get to chapter 10 and following is when you get less lengthy connections of passages, although there are some connections there, but there are more individual proverbs could appear there than in other places. But even the so-called independent proverbs finds connectedness through, say, word roots and other things where you're supposed to then draw some parallels. Okay? Let me show you a unique occurrence that occurs in chapter 9. I don't have it on the board here. Chapter 9 is talking about 2 kinds of women. One is a wise woman and one is a not so wise woman. Okay. The first part is about a wise woman who's telling people, trying to tell people to avoid certain negative, relations with an unwise woman, if you will. Right? And then it switches over and talks about the unwise woman. But in doing so, it utilizes the same terminology and the same language, same images, okay, in both of those sections. Okay, but one relates to a wise woman, one relates to an unwise woman. She does not know at the very end of the last section, verse 18. Does not know that the shades are there, that is, the dead ghosts are there, in the depths of Sheol, is her sons. Okay? But what I want to point out is the unique transition point. Transition point between the two. Okay? Look at verse 12, and the very last word of verse 12. Tisah. See that? Okay. Look at the very first word of verse 13. Patient. Now, take away the vowels. What do you have? You got the
same letters reversed.
Reversed. And that's the whole section. That whole section is a complete reversal from the preceding one using the same illustrations. That's what I'm saying. Now, nobody could translate that into a translation, be able to see that it's unique. It really is unique. And, it's fantastic. I checked a lot of commentaries, see if anybody picked that up and noticed that. Nobody notices that. Maybe they don't read their Hebrew Bible. I don't know. Not to be critical or anything. Let me show you another dimension of a proverb, wherein the key point of the proverb is in a line that doesn't even exist. In other words, it's a two-line proverb, but it's really 3 lines. Okay? You have to read 3 lines to get the full proverb. And nobody translates the 3rd line, of course. It's chapter 14, verse 34. Very common passage, 1294 page number. 1434. You know the passage by heart every 4th of July, of course, that's our sermon text. Righteousness exalts a nation, right? Remember the passage? Remember what the last line says? And the last part of that, righteousness exalts a nation.
But sin is a reproach.
Sin is a reproach to many people. That's how translation I think in King James or something. Okay. Now there's something really unique about this. If you look at the line, first line, everybody gets the first line pretty much right. Okay. Actually, if you take the English translation of that, just the way you translate it, sin is a reproach, then it's really not a very positive proverb. Because righteousness can lift up, but sin drags down. It's a reproach, it's negative. And every nation and every person and every nation sins, and there's only degrees of disgrace is all we're talking about. Degrees of disgrace, that's all we're talking about. Unless you read it differently. Now notice the first word in the second portion, which is hesed. There are 2 words pronounced and spelled exactly the same way, hesed. One of them means, and it's a common word used throughout the Old Testament. Hesed means what?
Faithful love.
Faithful love, loving kindness, covenant faithfulness. There's all kinds of translations for that, okay? And that's what you would read initially. You would hear that initially. Okay? The other word for that's the primary meaning of that particular word. The other word with the same spelling, same sound, is used 2 times in the Old Testament. And it means disgrace. Right? So, to begin with, when you read through the line, you're not going to read disgrace there. You're going to read hesed. That is loving kindness or faithfulness. That's what you're going to read there. Okay? If you're a Hebrew, know your vocabulary, speaking Hebrew. Okay, now 2 people with the rest of sin, the root name is the word for peoples, okay, which balances off the goy in the preceding line. Okay. But then there's that word chatat. What does chatat mean?
Sin or sin offering, right?
Primary meaning of sin is the word sin. Okay, that's the primary meaning. And there's a secondary meaning. And the secondary meaning is
sin offering.
Sin offering. Okay, so let's read it with the primary meanings. Righteousness exalts or lifts up a nation, but loving kindness, where our people is concerned, is sin. What is reread that? Okay, let's use the secondary meanings of these. Okay, let's go to the secondary meaning. So, righteousness exalts a nation, but disgrace to peoples is a sin offering. Well, that don't quite fit either, does it? Sin offering is a disgrace for people? What is it? Now let's kind of reword that a little bit. Let's read that again, okay? Let's change them around differently. Okay, let's say loving kindness for peoples is sin. That doesn't work, okay? Loving kindness for peoples is sin offering. Now, of course, the subject is the last word. That is in this form, but we have to remember that. So we could turn around in English. Okay. Now it becomes to make sense, and it becomes the fourth way to read it. Okay, and the way that gives the punchline. It solves the dilemma of just nothing but disgrace, just different degrees of it. Because then it would read, the sin offering is a loving kindness for people. But see, the problem with righteousness adults and nation side is that only there's what should we say, there is in every nation, in every person of every nation, there is sin, which is not righteousness. So there's only degrees of righteousness, and therefore degrees of exaltation or blessedness. Okay? But the solution to the problem of sin is what? In the Old Testament. So the sin offering is the solution. Okay? That's it. So the fact that there is a sin offering, that becomes then a point of loving kindness on God's part for people to solve the sin problem. Okay? So the verse needs to have that third line, okay? And you do get naturally to the third line if you're reading it in Hebrew, knowing the vocabulary, because you read initially and it doesn't make any sense. You have to reread it. You have to reassess the words, the application of these words. And once you finally get to what makes sense, you find that that's the solution to the problem. Okay?
I gotta switch.
You're going to switch.